Thank you very much. So prior to the pandemic, I spent a certain amount of my time advocating for remote work and trying to get more companies to shift to being remote first or even remote only organizations. And then the pandemic happened and I kind of got my wish, obviously, and we all shifted to remote work whether we wanted to or not. And you might think I'd be really pleased about that because I've been arguing that this was a thing we should do for ages. But I wasn't terribly. The problem with the way we experienced remote work during the pandemic was it was inevitably done in a rush. It was inevitably done on a sort of best endeavors basis because we kind of had to. And that was fine. It mostly worked for a bit. But I worry that if that's been your only experience of remote work, or alternatively, if that's been your organization's only experience of remote work, then what you've experienced is remote work done badly. And that's a pity. Because it turns out that there are some subtleties, there are some nuances to remote working that aren't immediately obvious, even though a lot of it appears very straightforward and simple. Doing remote work for the long term is actually quite hard in sort of weirdly unexpected ways that you need to be aware of. And part of our problem here is we have a long history of office work that we can go and draw on. So if we want to understand how working in offices works, there is an enormous amount of time that we can go back and look through. I mean, arguably, our first experience of office work was about the 15th century with scriptoria. The first actual dedicated office that I'm aware of was the Old Admiralty Office in London, which opened in 1726. By 1729, the East India Company was running its entire empire, and I use the word empire advisedly, from an office in London. And by about 1800, you can already find examples of office boredom and toxic workplace culture creeping in. So within about 220 years ago, we already start to have examples of things that didn't work very well. Whereas remote working, of course, doesn't have anything like that history. The history might be longer than you think, though. So the first example I can find is IBM. If you know IBM, you'll know that in the 1970s, IBM invented essentially everything. And one of the things they invented turns out to be remote work, somewhat surprisingly. So in 1979, IBM sent 5 employees home from their Santa Teresa laboratory in Silicon Valley with green screens, dumb terminals, and said, you folks go and work from home. This was apparently done to relieve congestion on the mainframe, and it presumably worked pretty well, because by 1983 there were 2,000 remote employees at IBM. Fast forward all the way to 2009, and a report I found said that, said that some 40% of some 386,000 employees in 173 different countries have no office at all. I make that 154,400 people, which is a lot of people. So if anyone tells you remote work doesn't scale, apparently it does. That also made this report, which was in the Wall Street Journal, somewhat surprising. This was in 2017, and what it says is the 105-year-old technology giant, that'll be IBM, is quietly dismantling its popular decades-old remote work program to bring employees back into offices in a move that it says will improve collaboration and accelerate the pace of work. And I particularly want to draw your attention to that last bit, improve collaboration and accelerate the pace of work, because that phrase, or phrases that sound a lot like it, get used a lot when companies decide they're going to bring remote working practices to an end. And that happens maybe more often than you might think. You might remember, for another pre-pandemic example, you might remember Yahoo during Marissa Mayer's tenure. So again, this was a pretty large company. It had a pretty large, widely used, widely regarded remote working practice, and Marissa Mayer decided to bring that to an end. Unsurprisingly, there was an HR memo, and unsurprisingly it leaked. All Things D got hold of it, and what it said was speed and quality are often sacrificed when we work from home. We need to be one Yahoo, and that starts with physically being together. Well, okay, the words are a little bit different, but that does sound quite a lot like improve collaboration and accelerate the pace of work, or at least it does to me. If you want a more up-to-date post-pandemic example, Sam Altman, very much in the news at the moment, obviously as OpenAI's CEO. ChatGPT seems to be everywhere right now. And he has said, I think definitely one of the tech industry's worst... Has my mic oh, there we are, we're on again. I think definitely one of the tech industry's worst mistakes in a long time was that employees could go full remote forever and startups didn't need to be together in person. And, you know, there was going to be no loss of creativity. I'm definitely having sound trouble. Sorry. What's going on there? Is that me bashing the thingy? No, that looks fine. Okay, thanks. Yes. So, as I say, there is another example. Again, it's a little bit different. The wording is a little bit different. But again, it's this idea that remote working makes creativity, makes collaboration a little bit difficult. One more of these would be Elon Musk. So Elon Musk is sort of famously, vehemently anti-remote work. He apparently was firing people at Tesla and SpaceX who were working remotely during the COVID-19 lockdowns when they were legally required to do so. And he has subsequently taken remote working off the table entirely at both Tesla and SpaceX, and I believe at Twitter, or the X company, or whatever the heck he's calling Twitter these days. So another person who is vehemently anti-remote working. Now, his argument is a little different, actually. His argument is more around productivity than it is around collaboration as such. And that probably reflects on his management style more than anything else. But I think it's interesting. And finally, Tim Cook is also cracking down on employees who don't come into the office at least 3 days a week. I guess if you spent that sort of money on your headquarters, that might bother you more. But, you know, again, it's kind of interesting. Tim Cook, of course, described remote work as the mother of all experiments during the pandemic. This idea that remote work is bad for collaboration is very widely held. And I think it sort of instinctively makes sense as well. I think instinctively we probably just assume this to be true. And it turns out there is some scientific research that even backs it up. This paper is from the Harvard Medical School website, and what it says is that scientists in close physical proximity to each other do better science and publish more impactful papers than scientists who are not co-located, which is interesting. And it surely begs the question, is remote working just a terrible idea? Is it an idea from the 1970s and early 1980s that honestly has no place in our modern, fast-paced, highly collaborative way of working? After all, if Agile and the methodologies that Agile has promoted have taught us anything, it's surely that the team will outperform the individual. Basically, that team collaboration is how you succeed in business. And therefore, surely anything that makes that more difficult must, by definition, be a bad thing. Well, fairly obviously, I wouldn't be on this stage if I thought that was true. I think that remote working is actually generally better. I think it's better for collaboration, which is very controversial, but I shall say it anyway. And I think it's better for performance for various reasons. But you do have to get the fundamentals right, and both the individual employees and the employer have to really want to make it work. Otherwise, it kind of doesn't. Who am I to claim such a thing? Well, I'm at Charles Humble on the socials. I've done most things in IT. I started my career in desktop support and made my way up over the course of about 20 years to be a CTO. I turned my attention to essentially content, joining InfoQ as their chief editor in 2014, and I then joined Container Solutions, where I am now as chief editor, in 2020. And in my copious spare time, I write music as a part of an ambient techno band called Two Fish. So if you didn't get your fill of electronic music earlier, feel free to look those up on the streaming platform of choice. One last gratuitous plug. I've also just done a book with my wonderful colleague Anne Curry, which you can download via that QR code for free from the Container Solutions website. Do please do that so my employee knows I'm here. Back to remote work. So remote working for you as an individual has a number of upsides, I think. One of these is that if you are autistic or and perhaps an introvert, something like that, then not having to interact with people face-to-face is, I am told, liberating. Now, I should say at this point, I am not personally autistic, though I am neurodiverse in other ways, but I do have quite a lot of experience of autism, both in my immediate and extended family, and I also spoke to a number of autistic remote workers when I was preparing this talk, and this was a bit of a theme that came up. Likewise, the introvert-extrovert splits never really made any sense to me at all. I presume I'm slap bang in the middle there somewhere, but it seems intuitively anyway that that would make sense. It's also the case that remote working allows you to flex your work around your home life more. And that actually was why I started remote working in the first place. So for me personally, my wife and I wanted to start a family, and I wanted to be around when the children were sort of young and growing up. So that was my original motivation. I was very lucky to find a company that was willing to let me do it. At the time it was relatively rare, I think. And I then found that, A, my children sort of needed me around quite a lot, but also it suited me as a way of working. And so I've worked that way ever since, full time. Remote working, of course, also means no commute. When I lived in London, my commute was an hour each way. That's 10 hours a week that I suddenly got back. And my longest commute was twice that, was about 20 hours a week. Which, when you think about it, is quite a lot of time, but you suddenly gain to, do more useful and interesting things than standing on a train or sitting in a car. You also get amazing peace and quiet, meaning you can concentrate and do proper deep work, and a work environment that you can tailor to your own particular needs. Which all sounds great, but it turns out that almost everything on this list comes with a catch. Something you might not think of. As an example, being able to flex your work around your home life means you've got to be incredibly disciplined about actually doing work. If you are prone to procrastination or otherwise struggle with self-motivation, remote working is frankly going to suck. And what's more, you might not know that yet. Because during the pandemic, you kind of had to, right? You sort of pushed through because you had to. But it turns out that whilst most of us can motivate ourselves for a day or two, or a week or two, or even perhaps a month or two, keeping yourself motivated day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, is actually quite hard, I think, for probably most of us. Those of you who are managers in the room, obviously if I hope you are by now, measuring your employees' outputs as distinct from, trying to measure other things, you'll get a feel for this over time. But as individual remote workers, I think you also have a bit of responsibility to try and come up with methods that help you to keep going and keep motivated when your motivation is flagging. When I joined InfoQ, Floyd Marinescu put me onto the Getting Things Done method, the David Allen method, and I've used it ever since. I find this very, very helpful for me personally. It's partly because the nature of work of a chief editor is largely unplanned. About 50% of my work typically is ad hoc, meaning I can't plan it in a sprint because I don't know what's coming. So the way David Allen's method works, it's incredibly simple, which is probably why I like it. In essence, when a piece of work comes in, you spend 2 minutes, you make an assessment of, is it going to take me 2 minutes or less to do this now? If the answer to that is yes, you do it there and then. If the answer to that is no, you stick it in some kind of central repository and then work from the central repository. The central repository I personally use is a tool called OmniFocus. This is Mac and iOS primarily, though there is also a web version. I really like it because it integrates really well with the rest of the Mac tool set, including things like Alfred and whatever. So, I have various automations that I built up over the years that just make this all flow quite nicely for me. I spoke to a few Getting Things Done practitioners, again, as part of the prep for this talk, and the other tool that seemed to come up the most is something called Todoist. I've not used Todoist myself, but that might be one to look at, particularly if you're a Windows user rather than a Mac user. Another technique that I have grown quite attached to is Pomodoro, and I'm aware at this point that you're all thinking, God, that's a bit basic. We all know Pomodoro, don't we? But I find it's one of these techniques that people forget about. I don't know why that is, probably because it is so obvious. I find it's quite useful. So in particular for me, one of my tasks is dealing with email. I might get a couple of hundred email in a day sometimes, perhaps more, and maybe half of those need a response. And I'll be honest, I'm not a professional email writer. It's not really what I want to be spending my time doing. And Pomodoro is brilliant for that because it's kind of like a mechanical, slightly boring process. You're not trying to get into flow state, you're just trying to get it done, really. And Pomodoro works brilliantly for that. So in case you haven't come across it, the way this works, you choose a task, email, you set a timer, 25 minutes is sort of typical default length, and I've always found that works fine. You work until the Pomodoro rings, and then you take a short break, stand up, stretch, whatever, and then rinse and repeat. And after you've done 4 of those, take a longer break, which in my case would be go for a walk or make a cup of tea, because I'm terribly English, or something like that, right? But basically take a break, and then if you've got more of that horrible stuff to do, plow on with it. And so I don't think it's brilliant for flow state, but I do think it's brilliant for anything that's just, frankly, grind. And we all have a bit of that in our working day, so that tends to be where I use it. I don't have a tomato timer, by the way. I use Siri on the iPhone for this because it's a use case for Siri on the iPhone, I suppose. But, again, always works for me. When we think about people who have worked remotely forever, the group of people that always come up for me is novelists. And I found myself wondering if any writers had any writing productivity tips. And one who did was Neil Gaiman. So he went on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and he said, I'm allowed to sit at my desk, I'm allowed to stare out at the world, I'm allowed to do anything I like, as long as it isn't anything. What I love about that is I'm giving myself permission to write or to not write, but writing is actually more interesting when doing nothing after a while. So again, this is a technique that I use. I will sit in my office with a cup of coffee and stare out the window. If I, for some reason, just can't get going, and it happens, but I will allow myself to sit with a coffee and stare out the window. And what I normally find is after about half an hour, my brain sort of goes, should we start work then? But what I don't do is I don't turn on a synthesizer and start doing sound design and writing tunes, because if I did that, 7 or 8 hours would probably go past, and I'd have a lovely time, but sadly that's not what I'm paid to do. So, Writers, of course, also have typically separate writing rooms. You might think of Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own, or maybe Roald Dahl's famous writing hut, which is in Great Missington. Actually, you can go and see the inside of it if you're ever in Great Missington. They've moved it to the museum, and you can actually see it, which is kind of fun. And this is a good thing to do if you possibly can. Having a physically separate office from your home is brilliant, because it means that there is a transition point between work and not work. Obviously, during the pandemic, that was not practical for an awful lot of people. Now that the pandemic is over, this is an option for more people, because you've got things like drop-in offices, and maybe, where I am in Surrey, quite a lot of farmers have converted like a stable block to be an office you can rent for not very much money, as an example. If you're very lucky and have a garden or an outbuilding or something, obviously think about whether you want to convert that to an office. And all of those things help you to do that transitioning stuff. And that matters, because otherwise what happens is your work life and your home life kind of bleed together until you're just working all the time. And that's not good, frankly, for anybody. Now, it may be that none of these options work out for you for one reason or another, and that's fair enough. Someone I interviewed told me that his particular method for this was that he commuted to his house every day. So what he did was he would leave the front door, he would walk around the block, and then he'd come back in the front door and start work. And then at the end of the day, he'd do the same thing again and stop working. And I'll be honest, when he first told me this, I thought, that's a bit mad, isn't it? But actually, when you think about it, it's sort of doing the same job. It's cueing to your brain, I am working, I am not working. And again, it gives you a fixed transition point, which is a good thing to do, I would say. Back to our list of advantages. Amazing peace and quiet, meaning you can really concentrate and do proper deep work. So, there is a cost of coordination for remote work. I'm not actually convinced it is higher than the cost of coordination for in-office work, but it's certainly more visible. And one of the reasons it's more visible is because we tend to use tools like Slack and email and those sort of things, and they all ping at you all the time, which distracts you from doing whatever it is you're doing. The other thing, of course, is if you haven't separated your office from your house, and your house is anything like mine, you have things like that going on all the time. That's not actually my child, I should say, although, frankly, it could be. Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton, who of course wrote the Team Topologies book, have also written a remote working team interactions workbook, which essentially takes team topologies and applies some of the logic of it to remote working. And they make the point that well-defined interactions are key to effective teams, and this is especially true for remote working situations. Part of well-defined interactions is knowing what are and aren't acceptable responses to stuff. So you probably need some kind of company-wide communication policy. Now, your company might not have one of these, in which case you could be the person to write it. You'd be an absolute hero, and they're not honestly very difficult to write. The other option is you could write one for your particular team if you don't have anything in place. So it might be, effectively, this is our emergency, everything is on fire channel. Perhaps that's WhatsApp or something like that. So we're all in a WhatsApp group. We don't mute that, and we all understand that we only use that if, like, everything is on fire and we need you now. And then we can set an acceptable response time for Slack, which might be, I don't know, every 3 hours or something like that. So basically you check Slack twice a day, and then email 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever works for you. Once you've got something like that in place, you can use things like Do Not Disturb to stop getting notifications when you're trying to concentrate, and that will help you get into flow state. I kind of want to hammer this point a bit because I think it's one of the luxuries that remote work gives you that office work, in my experience, doesn't. I don't know about you, but I cannot concentrate in open plan offices, basically, unless there's no one else there. And it gets worse if companies have done trendy things like say, let's get rid of all the meeting rooms because we want to have fewer meetings. It doesn't result in fewer meetings. What it results in is people having impromptu meetings at their desks, which is hell on earth. If you want an example of somebody who really got this, then Bill Gates famously used to conduct Think Weeks twice a year when he was chairman of Microsoft. So what he would do is he would take a stack of papers and he would rent a holiday cottage and he would go and sit and think deep, meaningful thoughts about the tech industry and Microsoft's place in it. Did anything significant come out of any of those meetings? Well, one thing that did was the Internet Tidal Wave memo from 1995. That was the memo that turned Microsoft's attention to both the Internet in general and Netscape in particular. Was that a good thing? Well, it probably wasn't if you were Netscape, in fairness. But it probably was if you were the chairman of Microsoft. If you find that this is sort of challenging for you in terms of this concentration, as I say, we do live in an incredibly distracted sort of society. Carl Newport's book, Deep Work, is well worth a read, I think. He has lots and lots of practical examples in here, lots of case studies, and just sort of practical tips. So if this is something that you struggle with, this is worth thinking about. Back to our list again. I mentioned no commute, and you probably think, well, that's surely got to be a win, hasn't it? And yeah, it might sound surprising. I actually quite missed commuting. I mean, I didn't miss standing on a smelly, horrible train trying not to stick my nose in somebody else's armpit. I didn't miss that bit at all. But I did miss the time to myself. That time for reading, for listening to podcasts and so on, that I suddenly didn't have. I also, because I'm not, as you can probably tell, naturally a fitness kind of a person, I also realized quite quickly that I was doing no exercise at all, because most of my exercise would involve running for the train when I was late or walking for it when I wasn't. Unsurprisingly, the mitigation for this is exactly what you'd expect. It's make time for yourself. So schedule time in your day to go for a walk every day or a run if you're lucky enough that not as old as me and can still run. But otherwise, walking is also good. And I also recommend getting some kind of fitness tracker. It doesn't necessarily need to be anything as fancy as an Apple Watch, though they are nice. I actually use the step counter on my phone. Works perfectly well for me. Just something, again, to keep you a little bit motivated if fitness isn't one of your things. I also mentioned a work environment that you can tailor to your own personal needs. That is just a straightforward win. I have worked in some really terrible offices. like the most appalling places you could imagine. Actually, I don't think she'll mind me telling you this story. My wife is a bit of a nerd, and when she and I met, well before we were married, we were both working in a retail bank in the UK, and one day she came in with a tape measure, and she measured the gaps between the chairs and the desks in this office, and then she went and looked up what the rules were, because it turns out there are rules about this stuff, for how close you could have human beings physically co-located in an office, so how close physical proximity you could have people in an office. And what she discovered was someone in this retail bank's facilities department had clearly beaten her to it, because we were to within about 1 millimetre of the legal limit for how close you were allowed to pack people into an office. Tragically, I didn't take a picture of this building, but honestly, if you picture something like that, you're not that far away. So being able to tailor your office to your needs is a win, but it isn't necessarily particularly cheap. You know, laptops are quite expensive, monitors are quite expensive, keyboards are quite expensive. You also need to think about things like, can you get decent internet? This is actually a huge problem for me at the moment because I have fibre to the cabinet. I'm not quite sure where the cabinet is, but from the cabinet to my house is a piece of copper that was presumably installed before the war or something, and doesn't work terribly well. Also things like office furniture, office chairs, standing desks, all of that kind of stuff, it all adds cost. Now your employer might have a policy to help you pay for some of this stuff, and certainly if they're a remote-first organisation, I would argue that they absolutely should do, but they might not. And again, it's something to think about. If you are changing jobs at the moment, and goodness knows an awful lot of us are, and negotiating your package at your next place, and planning to work remotely, I would strongly encourage you to factor some of this stuff into the conversations you have when you get to that point, because it actually makes quite a big difference. The last topic I want to touch on in this particular section is around mental health, and specifically around burnout. Now, when I was writing this talk originally, I had quite a few slides at this point and did quite a lot of research, and then I took them all out again. And the reason I took them all out again is because I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not really qualified to talk about this, but I do want to. Because burnout is actually quite endemic in our industry, and we don't talk about it very much. And I apologise if I'm making anyone a little bit uncomfortable. I know this is a hard topic for people. I have personally lost a colleague to burnout. What's more, I went through it myself, and I didn't realise for quite a long time what was happening to me. And it was quite scary and quite dark. And I might not have made it. This is a big deal, and we don't talk about it. If you are having problems with your mental health, get help from a mental health professional. Don't mess around with this stuff. Don't ask random people on the internet, what should I do? Because they're not going to know. Get help from a mental health professional. You know, if your physical health is suffering for some reason, you go and talk to a doctor. If your teeth hurt, you go and talk to a dentist. But for some reason, if you're having mental health problems, I think there's a reluctance to talk to a mental health professional. Likewise, if a colleague or somebody you manage or a friend is having some kind of mental health problem you suspect, whether that's depression or addiction or something in that territory, try and find an opportunity to, as quietly and gently as you can, check in with them and see if they're getting some sort of help. It matters, it's just possible you might save somebody's life. A level below burnout is loneliness. So again, if you think about it, you're working in a room on your own day after day, week after week, month after month. I think most of us discovered during the pandemic, even people like me who thought they'd been practicing for the pandemic their entire lives, that it actually turned out that people did matter. And I quite missed social interaction. And I know it sounds ludicrous, but do make your social life a priority. I don't know if it's just me, but I mean, for me, this requires a level of activation energy, and I don't know, sometimes it's just, oh, really think I can be bothered. But it does pay you back. Likewise, if you have a family, make your family a priority. Life is not all about work, thank goodness. I have also discovered, by the way, that pets can help. Pets are awesome, dogs particularly, because dogs force you to get out into nature, and this is a fine and excellent thing. I do not have a dog, I have a cat. This is what she looks like. Her name is Maridadi. This is an actual conference call. I've blacked out the people on the right there, but this is a real call. I'm fairly sure people think I have like a cat tail on a stick, and I just sort of wave it in front of the monitor or something, but she is a real cat. She's everything you expect of a cat. She's terrible. She scratches me. She bites me. I had to buy, this is a new jumper, just for you all, because when I got all of my jumpers out of my cupboard, I discovered she put holes in every single one of them, bless her. And she's old and cantankerous, but she spends all her time in my office rather, because she sleeps on the laptop, because laptops are warm. So much so, actually, I had to find out what the keyboard commands were to disable the keyboard on the laptop so she could sleep on that, because it was overheating. Which was fine until I got to the airport and then realised I had essentially a very expensive brick. There you go, look, real cat. I wanted to let it spool on so you could see that. So yeah, genuinely, honestly, cats or dogs can help. It also turns out there is a growing body of actual scientific research that tells us that getting out into nature and walking every day is genuinely good for our mental health. That might be surprising, but it's becoming quite a well-researched area now, and it does turn out to be true. So again, at the risk of hammering this point a bit, make time for yourself, get out into nature is a very good thing. I have shamelessly put my sister Kate Humble's book up there, because it's a lovely book, and it's about walking, and it's such an unusual tech conference book recommendation that I just couldn't resist it. So if you want to read about walking, then there's that book there. It also turns out that the way your organization is designed and how it operates also has quite a bearing on some of this stuff. And so for the second half of this talk, that's what we're going to focus in on. But before we get there, I just want to briefly touch on why your company might want to think about going remote first or all in on remote. The first reason is that your overheads are obviously much lower as a company, right? Buildings are expensive to maintain, facilities are expensive, and so on. So there is a cost saving. It's not very exciting, but in this particular climate, it is a factor. Also, if you get the hiring right, and getting the hiring right turns out to be quite hard, but if you get the hiring right, in my experience, your employees will be happier and more productive. I completely disagree with Elon Musk on this, by the way. It used to be true that actually your retention rates tended to be lower as well, but I don't think that's true anymore because basically everyone has so many more options in terms of places they can work remotely. That said, I think it probably is true that if you are not doing remote work well, that's probably becoming a competitive disadvantage for your company. It's also the case that you can hire the best people because location is largely irrelevant. It's not completely irrelevant, but it's somewhat irrelevant. And again, as we saw with our first list, all of these things come with catches. Martin Fowler wrote a very good blog post around this a while ago, and he said that a remote team may be less productive than the same team if it were co-located, but it may still be more productive than the best co-located team you can form. The reason for that, if you think about it, is just the width of the talent pool you suddenly have. So if you have a physical office in London, you can hire anybody in London, and you can hire within about an hour of London, right? And that's it. That's your entire pool. What's more, you can only hire people that can come into an office every day if you expect people to be in an office every day. So as we've already said, that takes out quite a lot of autistic people, for example, but it also might take out people who are single parents. It might take out people who are caring for an elderly relative, and all of that whole category of people as well. If you're hiring remotely, all of those people suddenly become potential hires for you. And what's more, not only can you hire in London, you can hire all the way across Europe and are probably about as far as the east coast of the States. Much more than that, and time zones start to become a problem, but up to about 5 hours I've generally found works fine. The problem is remote hiring is tricky. For one thing, location isn't totally irrelevant. Countries have complex tax regimes that you need to understand if you're hiring people, and possibly complicated employment law, which again, if you're planning to hire and fire, you need to know how that works in that particular location. And it's also the case that not all locations, as I've said, can get decent internet and that kind of thing, so that does cross a few people off. The other thing is, that with time zones, if you get more than about 5 hours, then what tends to happen is you get bunching of meetings. So I managed a team where we had some people in London and some people in San Francisco, and what happened initially was we had all of our meetings at the end of the day for the people in London and the start of the day for the people in San Francisco. And then that wasn't enough meetings, because of course it wasn't, because you can never have enough meetings. So what then happened was the San Francisco people started working earlier and earlier, and the European people started working later and later. And that's not brilliant. So I think, as I say, up to about 5 hours is generally fine. Much more than that's probably a bit more of a problem. Another challenge here is that interviewing remotely is particularly hard. Partly this is down to things like body language and eye contact and all of those sorts of things. The signals that we use that are quite subconscious when we're interviewing people that you just don't have, because video interviewing doesn't have that level of fidelity. But it's also down to things like you can't tell what the candidate's looking at. So they might have notes in front of them, they might be looking things up, and you wouldn't necessarily know that. It's arguable how much of a problem that is, but it's certainly not the same as interviewing face-to-face. I recommend having a fairly lengthy probation period for this reason. 3 months seems to work quite well. Normally by then, both the person you're hiring and you know if this is working or not. I would also say that for key hires particularly, it's a good idea to actually fly them somewhere and meet in person. That obviously doesn't scale. You can't do that for everyone in a company, but you can do it for the key hires, I think, and it's probably worthwhile. If you're going to do this, obviously pay for the flight, but also pay for the time, so that they don't feel out of pocket if they don't get the job, right? So like a day rate at whatever you pay for your day rate, 500 or something, so they feel like they're not out of pocket. And then the other thing you need is a really robust onboarding process. So that means things like having an onboarding process that's actually documented, that involves the new hire getting introduced to the key people in the company. I quite like buddying systems, and I particularly like having a dual buddy system. So basically where you have somebody on your team that's showing you the ropes and someone from a completely different team who's also helping you get up to speed within the company. That way, you eliminate some of those sort of early networking problems that you typically get otherwise in a remote working context. At an organizational level, remote working basically depends on it being a high trust environment. You can't see what people are doing, so you have to assume they're doing the right thing. And I also think that you need strong psychological safety in remote environments. You might be familiar with the work Google did, the Project Aristotle work. This was some fantastic research that Google did where they looked at what gave you high-performing teams at Google. And basically one of the things it says is the number one factor of high-performing teams at Google is psychological safety. And everyone thinks that means you need psychological safety to have high-performing teams. You don't. As it turns out, I've worked on teams with no psychological safety at all by design that were extremely high performing. They were absolutely horrible. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it at all. You know, this will be your knife. But it does work as a way of working. It's just not nice. But I don't think it works remotely. And the reason I don't think it works remotely is because you need people to be able to tell you stuff because you can't see it and you can't just sort of pick it up in the ether. I think people also quite often misunderstand what psychological safety means. It doesn't just mean being nice to each other. It essentially means that if I challenge you and you are in a position of authority, that's considered a good thing. So if I bring a new idea to the table, or if I say to my CEO, do you know what, Mr. CEO or Mrs. CEO, I think you're losing the plot here for these reasons, so long as it's done in a reasonably respectful and considered way, that's not a career-limiting move. If it is, you don't have psychological safety, whatever it says on your, nice website with all your core values and stuff in it. Trust at an organizational level means obviously trusting your employees, and trust in a company starts at the top and comes downwards. It does not work the other way. What that means is if you're in a senior position, you need to think very, very carefully when you're making public statements if you're not sure you're going to honor them, for example, because you can lose trust incredibly quickly. So if you, again, given the macroeconomic climate we find ourselves in, if you say we're not going to make any people redundant, and then 2 months later you lay off 25% of the company, no one who's left in the company is ever going to trust anything you say again, right? Because why on earth would they? And your whole system will start to break down. And what I've also found is that once you lose trust, it's incredibly difficult to get it back again. We'll touch on this again in a moment, but I also want to dig in a little bit to this business of cost of coordination of meetings. There is a thing that tends to happen in remote companies when they're not very experienced at this, which is basically your day just ends up being nothing but coordination meetings, and it's deadly. If you find that you're getting too many of these, too many status meetings is the typical sign of this, then think about the meetings you actually need. What I've done here is I put a sort of composite together of both C4 Media and Container Solutions and the meetings that they use. Both companies have in-person meetings from time to time. So C4 Media would bring the entire company together once a year. That would include the China operation and the Brazilian operation that we otherwise wouldn't meet. And we'd spend about 3 days together. We'd have a day of formal presentations, then we'd have a day of what's essentially open space, and then we'd have like a day of sightseeing when everyone's brains have melted and they've had enough thinking about work time. That's quite an expensive thing to do, but it turned out that doing that gave the company and its employees enough forward momentum to make the rest of the year kind of make sense. And then we would have departmental meetings that were in person about 3 times a year, typically. So the smaller in-person meetings are about 3 times a year. I don't think you can do remote working without occasionally getting people together. I just don't think you need to do it every day or even every week. 3 times a year, maybe 4 times a year is probably about fine, depending a little bit on your own individual company. Container Solutions also does a monthly all-hands meeting. That's a virtual meeting. Everyone in the company can attend. Executives are expected to be on that call. We use an application called Pigeonhole, which essentially allows people to ask questions without having to grab the microphone and ask a question in front of 100 plus people, which might be a bit terrifying. And the executives are expected to answer those questions. And again, part of what's happening there is you're signaling this idea of transparency. And that, again, is part of this whole sort of trust model, which is essentially, I think, how you make this stuff work. We then do sprint planning. That's exactly what you'd expect. It's every 2 weeks, standard sprint planning stuff. We do a demo at the end of the 2 weeks. The demo is filmed, and the video of that, or at least some of the demo is filmed. And then the film of it is put on a public Slack channel, so like the Slack announcements channel that everyone in the company sees. And then, what you hope happens is the CEO, etc., come in and they make comments on what the work people are doing is. We all need a bit of positive reinforcement from time to time, and it's nice to know that the people at the top of the company are paying attention to the work you're doing. A level below that is the departmental meeting. I've become quite a fan of the check-in sort of ritual, which comes out of Peopleware, the core protocols in Peopleware. If you're not familiar with this, you can go and download that book by Richard Kapowski for 3 from InfoQ, which explains it. The actual core protocols version is quite formal, and I find it a little bit strange, but essentially it has a standard vocabulary, which is, I am one of sad, glad, mad, afraid, because, and then you give a reason. I always find that that's a bit mechanical, although I did find on a couple of teams it worked quite well. More commonly, what I do is I just have a space at the beginning of the meeting where everyone just gives a status update. Now, you probably know as a manager, what you do is much more important than what you say. Right, your employees will tend to mirror, to some extent, the action they see from you, much more than whatever it is you say. So if you want to get psychological safety going and trust and transparency going, the check-in is an opportunity that you can use to signal that this stuff is okay. So as an example, you could say something like, I don't know, I'm having a bit of trouble with my physical health at the moment. I'm a bit worried. I've got to go to the doctor. I don't quite know what's wrong. It's making me a little bit nervous. So apologies if I'm not maybe as focused as I should be, something like that. What you're doing by doing that is you're signaling to the people that report to you that it's okay to share that kind of stuff. And then they'll share that kind of stuff too, and that allows you to get a bit of a pulse on how the team is doing. It doesn't mean every check-in has to be negative. I mean, if you're off having fun at the weekend, brilliant, talk about that, whatever. But just occasionally, it's quite a good thing to signal. The next level down from that is one-on-one meetings. I personally think one-on-one meetings are sacrosanct, particularly again in a remote context. If you want to really annoy me, start cancelling one-on-one meetings at the last minute or moving them around. It drives me insane. A one-on-one meeting should not be a status meeting. If you're using it as a status meeting, you are, as Steve Jobs might put it, doing it wrong. What you want to be doing instead is using it to talk about things like career development, where your report wants to be going, much more than what they're currently working on. Hopefully you're like sprint process or whatever it is you do to manage work covers the status stuff. So the one-on-one meeting should be much more around, as I say, where you're going, that kind of thing. Keep notes for these in a shared document that you both have access to. Google Docs is perfectly fine for this. And if you find your one-on-one meetings are a bit dull, Camille Fournier's book, The Manager's Path, has a whole section on one-on-one meetings with a whole bunch of brilliant alternative ways of structuring them and patterns and so on. It's really good. It's also, I think, the best book I've ever read on that whole thing of transitioning from being an engineer to being a manager to being a CTO. It would have saved me an awful lot of mistakes if I'd read it when I was doing that transition, but sadly it wasn't out. But if you're doing that kind of transition, that book is tremendous. In terms of tooling, you need something for instant messaging. Slack seems to be pretty much the default. Video conferencing, Zoom or Google Meet is fine. Google Docs, pretty much every remote company I know of these days seems to run everything on Google Docs because CRDTs for the win, I guess. And I'm also quite a fan of private retrospectives. I've tried introducing a tool called 15.5 in at least 2 companies, and it seems to be one of those tools. There's an English expression which is it's a Marmite tool. I've no idea if that translates, but basically you either like it or you hate it. I like it, other people don't. And what we found over time in both companies I introduced this to was that use of it would start really high and then it would sort of gradually tail off. So what I do instead now is I just do a private retrospective. So at the end of the Friday, I basically just sit down for 15 minutes and go through what worked well, what did not work well, what I'm planning to do first thing on Monday morning and for the rest of the next week. And again, part of the thing there is it sort of allows me to put work down and then go and focus on family and having a good time and not thinking too much about work, because otherwise I tend to get into that sort of trap of just continually thinking about work. As you scale remote working up, you start to hit another problem, which is that your employees need to be incredibly autonomous. If you're familiar with Dan Pink's work, you probably know this idea that autonomy, mastery, and purpose are sort of motivators, but in a lot of companies, actually, you don't have a great deal of autonomy. With remote work, you kind of have to, because again, you don't know what your employees are doing, so you have to trust that they're doing the right thing. And what happens quite often is when you get to about 100 people, normally is where this starts to happen if you're a startup, all of your processes all break all at once because you suddenly hit a kind of inflection point. And one of the things is people don't really know what the company's for anymore, and they go off and do all sorts of weird and exciting things that have nothing to do with what you were trying to do. We hit this at C4 Media, and we stumbled across the Rockefeller habits, which is Vern Hirsch's work. And he has a bunch of what he calls the Rockefeller habits, but he also has a structure which I came to see as a sort of pyramid hierarchy, like this one. He has at the top something he calls the Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal, or BHAG. It's a terrible name. He actually got it from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. And then also the company purpose. And the point here is if you have these things very well defined, then they act as a bit of a filter so that your employees start to be able to say, well, we probably shouldn't do that because it's completely irrelevant. If you want an example of a BHAG, the one that Jim Collins uses is NASA's to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely. It's a very fine and excellent BHAG. I actually quite like the Microsoft one, which was a computer on every desktop and in every home. And at the time, that sounded incredibly unlikely. Really very improbable indeed. Of course, the nature of the world has changed a lot since, and now it seems like, well, obviously. But at the time, that was quite a big deal. And again, it sort of acts as a motivator. The other thing that happens as you scale up is you find you need a really strong written culture. And that's particularly important as you spread across time zones, because as I said, often written communication is the only form of communication you have when you get beyond a certain scale. That's a bit of a pity because remote communication is quite hard. One of the reasons it's quite hard is because it's hard to pick up nuance in things like tone and in how urgent something is on text. It's also the case that you get problems that arise from cultural differences. So phrases that make sense in one language, like my Marmite expression, that perhaps don't make sense to other people, that kind of thing. One little tip here is to try and make any message that you write self-contained. So if you are dragging someone into a lengthy Slack thread, don't say, hey Jane, what do you think about this? say something like, hey Jane, what do you think about moving from component B to component A because of the performance problems in component A, or something that gives the person arriving in the thread some context, so they don't have to go back and read the entire Slack thread just in order to understand what you're even asking them. Does that make sense? It's just showing a little bit of respect for the people that you're bringing in all the time. Again, Matthew Pais and Manuel Skelton say that ultimately in a remote work world, it's essential to be very clear about, be very clear all the time about what you're working on, why you're working on it, how your work is being completed, and when it should be completed by. And that, I think, is also why we end up with so many status meetings if we don't think about this stuff. And status meetings are boring. Nobody wants lots of status meetings. So try and make sure you've got something, whether that's, I don't know, Jira and your sprint planning, or something that's communicating state all the time, so you don't have to keep constantly doing it, because, frankly, that's a waste of everybody's time. To try and bring this to some sort of conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that both for employee and employer, remote work requires a level of intentional design to work well. It doesn't just happen if you want to do it long term. I would also encourage you to separate your home from your work through physical separation if at all possible, but if not, I hopefully gave you a few other suggestions for how you might be able to make that work. And prioritize your mental health. Take it seriously. If in doubt, speak to a mental health professional. Prioritize your social life, take exercise, take breaks. Finally, both the company and its managers need to exhibit transparency and be prepared to be vulnerable in order for remote working to work. If you're not prepared to do that as an individual or as a company, remote working is not going to work for you, I don't think. In terms of the books that influenced me, these are the main ones that the only one of those I managed to get on a slide was the Team Topologies one there. So that and Team Topologies together is obviously excellent. Traction is very good. Drive, the Dan Pink book, is also still excellent. And Scaling Up is the sort of successor to Vern Hirsch's Rockefeller Habits, and again is a really, really good book if you're thinking about how to manage particularly a smaller company, I think. You know, a small to medium-sized business. And with that, thank you very much indeed for listening.